This episode is brought to you by Modal Electronics, who enable you to play and perform powerful sound with their incredible synthesizers. You can enjoy vibrant wavetable patches with the Argon 8 series, or you can produce with state-of-the-art analog-style synth textures with the Cobalt 8 series. To check out Modal Electronics' incredible array of synthesizers, go to modalelectronics.com. Modal Electronics. Dare to sound different.
The earliest thing I remember was because, I'm very old. So in I think it was 1968, I would have been 3 years old. And my mother and I were living by a prison in Danbury, Connecticut, which, if you can imagine, it's, not the happiest of places. We were living in this old Victorian rooming house. And I remember it was winter time, and we were in the car, and we just pulled up to the house, and we're getting ready to go inside, and Proud Mary by Cridland's Clearwater Revival came on. And this is one of my first memories, is I categorically refused to get out of the car until the song had ended. So where are you right now?
I'm in the UK. I'm in Northamptonshire.
Okay, so imagine Northamptonshire in the middle of February, and there's a car with no heat, and there's this little AM radio. And so my mother is freezing cold, and there I am at 3 years old, refusing to get out of the car until Proud Mary had ended. So it's freezing cold, it's raining, and there's this petulant little 3-year-old who's just transfixed on this piece of music.
Well, I mean, it's a great piece of music, and I can see why you'd have been transfixed. But did that lead to you? When did you start playing? Because you learned guitar and piano growing up, is that right?
Yeah. So I grew up in the weirdest musical household. My mom played piano. My great grandmother actually taught classical composition and violin. My uncle was a flautist, and everyone in my family just had the most eclectic musical tastes. My mom loved Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young, but she also loved Blind Lemon Jefferson. She also loved Dvorak and Stravinsky. She loved John Coltrane. So I grew up surrounded by all this weird music. And then when I was around 9 years old, my mom, who was also a painter, rented some painting studio space in a big loft in Connecticut. And she shared the space with these drug dealing musicians. And so I would go with her to her painting space, and to entertain myself, I would bang around on their instruments. And my mom sort of thought, okay, why not get him music lessons? So at least if he's going to bang around on instruments, it will be approaching something that someone could listen to. So that I was around, I guess, 8 or 9 years old, and she signed me up for guitar lessons with this very odd, quasi-formal music teacher.
And were those, did you enjoy those lessons, and do you think that they benefited you?
Yeah, so I was, from the time I was 9 until around 13 or 14, I studied music theory. His name's Chris Rizzola, and I think he's still teaching music in Florida. He was such a fascinating oddball because he played guitar in a heavy metal band, but he loved very complicated jazz and very complicated classical music. So and I didn't really care about jazz, and I didn't really care about heavy metal. I liked classical music. But we did so much complicated but idiosyncratic music theory work. And then when I was 13, I discovered The Clash. And I think I broke his heart because he wanted me to go on to be this virtuoso guitarist, multi-instrumentalist, and I just wanted to play Clash covers.
So that's already, because in your music and the music that you've gone on to make there, you can't almost trace, you can tell that there are so many different things influence wise that go into it. But I mean, this is helping paint quite a broad picture of like musical influences. In terms of like going from Credence, you know, to the Clash, what were the things that you kind of liked as a fan between that, hearing that first record and kind of getting into punk? Because I know you got into kind of punk bands and things after that.
Yeah, well, in the 70s, I was basically obsessed with every single song that was played on the radio. If it was played on the radio, I loved it. Almost like I didn't even really have taste or standards. Like anything I heard on the radio, I thought was phenomenal. Whether that was the Eagles or Elton John or Donna Summer or the Bee Gees, maybe from the time I was 3 years old until the time I was 10 years old, I don't remember disliking a song on the radio.
I mean, it was a good time for radio. Those artists.
It was, I mean, and I would listen to Casey Kasem's Top 40 obsessively and religiously every week. You know, like, and it was so important to me that I knew every single song in the top 40, and I would follow like, oh, well, you know, like I Feel Love has gone from 12 to 15. Like, I wonder what's going to take its place. And then I had this period around the time I was 10 years old, 11 years old, where I tried to like the music that I thought I was supposed to like. And part of that was the complicated jazz fusion that my music teacher liked. You know, artists like Larry Carlton, Weather Report, Stanley Turrentine. And no 11-year-old should be listening to Stanley Turrentine. I mean, not to malign that music, but it's not all that interesting for a 10-year-old. And then the cool kids at my school were really into, you know, the sort of like the slightly harder classic rock. And I liked it, but I didn't love it. But you couldn't say that to the cool kids because you had to, you know, like appease the cool kids by saying that you loved Black Dog by Led Zeppelin.
So they were into that.
And that takes me up. And then when I was 13, as I mentioned, like all of a sudden, like the scales fell from my eyes or ears, and I heard Elvis Costello, and I heard The Clash, and I heard Gary Newman, and I heard Devo, and the B-52s, and then the Sex Pistols. And it was like my year zero where I decided I didn't like any music made before 1976.
And in terms of that, was part of it, you know, how much of that was like related to the music and how much was it related to the attitudes around? I mean, it's quite difficult to know, you know, the exact amount, but was a lot of it the kind of the punk attitude as opposed to just the music, even though there's great music as well?
Well, I mean, because I was living in suburban Connecticut, so I didn't really know the difference between punk and new wave. You know, I loved the Sex Pistols, I loved the Damned, but I also loved Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark and Joy Division and Gary Newman. To me, it just was so new and it was so dynamic. And I mean, to this day, I love old classic rock, but the old classic rock at that time had become so sedate, almost like lethargic, you know, like, yeah. And now I've come to really appreciate like bands like Yes, Supertramp, you know, like they're great. But again, when you're 13 years old, a 12-minute Yes song can't compete with I Fought the Law by The Clash.
Yeah, it's not as kind of cathartic. It's almost just trying too hard to be sophisticated.
And also the things that the people that they were singing about, like, you know, the punk rock bands, the new wave bands were either singing about science fiction or smashing the state or alienation. And I could relate to those three things. And then you'd listen to classic rock and they were singing about, you know, like standing on stage in front of 100,000 people and then having sex with groupies. And I was like, I can't really, I'm 13 years old living in the suburbs. I cannot relate to that.
Yeah, fair. I mean, that is absolutely fair enough. And you kind of, especially at that age, you want to be able to relate to it. A couple of things. Earlier, you said you were kind of getting into keeping track of the charts. Was that a sense that you kind of had ambitions of your own? And when you got into punk and new wave, was that the time that you started to join bands?
Yeah, I mean, I had my only musical ambition for the longest time, and I would say that's even kind of the case now. My only musical ambition was to spend time listening to music and playing music. And, you know, and reading about music and thinking about music and talking about music. Like, I didn't know that having a professional life as a musician was within the realm of possibility for me. So when I was 13, maybe 14, I started my first band. I had 3 or 4 other friends in the town where I lived who also admitted to liking punk rock and new wave. Because at this point, like, punk rock, new wave, any music made by people with short hair was desperately uncool in suburban Connecticut. You know, to the point where, like, I remember Jim, our bass player, I guess it was the first day of high school, he wore a Talking Head shirt to high school and he got beat up for it.
My God.
You know, like, it was so brave that, like, you couldn't believe he was wearing a Talking, and it sounds like an Ali G episode, but it's actually true. Like, he wore a Talking Head shirt to high school, and the stoners were so offended, you know, because they hated Devo, they hated The Clash because they thought it was gay, they thought it was weird, they, you know, like, and so I had my few friends who admitted to liking punk rock and new wave, and we started a band when we were 14, just basically to play Clash covers, to play Sex Pistols covers. We played a Richard Hell and the Boydoids cover. And we never expected anyone to pay attention. In fact, our first ever concert, and I'm not making this up, our first ever concert was in a field next to John, the other guitar player's house. We set up our equipment in a field and invited all of our friends, and no one showed up. Literally, no one showed up except for John's dog, Sparky, who sort of stood there and watched us play our first punk rock show.
Was that incredibly demoralizing at the time? As funny?
No, it was exciting, because our expectations were so low that just setting up equipment in a public place, even if it was a field with no people, that was exciting.
Yeah.
You know, putting an amp in a guitar, putting an amp in the back of a car, that was exciting. Tuning a guitar, buying guitar strings and learning how to string a guitar, like, these things were, like, we didn't want more than that. We were perfectly happy with just these, like, really basic facets of playing music.
And when did you gig a lot after that first gig?
Well, yeah, never too much of an audience. A big show would be 20 people. Trying to think, like, until I was maybe 25 or 26, I don't think I ever played music for more than 20 or 30 people at a time.
That's, yeah. I mean, that I guess that kind of makes sense. But wasn't there a spell though when you were before you'd kind of had that, like, first hit, when you were DJing and doing things like that? Was that still very small?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest DJ gig I got was there was a club in New York called Mars, and somehow in 1989 I managed to get a job there as a DJ. And the big room at Mars held 250 people, and I couldn't believe how excited, like, to play in a room with 250 people was the most exciting thing I'd ever experienced. I was in New York City in 1989 playing dance music to 250 people. That was, like, if that had been the the pinnacle of my career, I would have been pretty happy.
But what was driving? So when you moved kind of from being in a band to, what was the thing that kind of led you to get interested in DJing and electronic music?
I mean, it's worth sort of contextualizing it a bit, which is these genres, especially in New York and in other places, but these genres really coexisted. I mean, obviously not the extremes, but, think of a band like New Order, who became a synth band. Much
electronic stuff. Yeah.
And they started out trying to play Stooges covers, like it was, Killing Joke were a very aggressive punk band, essentially, but a lot of their songs had synthesizers and drum machines. So I don't think I was doing anything unique in having this sort of weird eclectic approach to music. I loved, and also my friends and I would go to clubs in New York, like Danceteria, the Peppermint Lounge. This is, 81, 82, 83. And you would go to see a punk rock band. The DJ beforehand would be playing reggae. And then afterwards you'd go upstairs and there'd be a DJ playing disco and hip hop. And so we just thought, oh, this is the world of music doesn't care about genre. Like, genre can be exciting, but the idea was you pledged allegiance to this world of music irrespective of genre. Yeah, so I guess so to your question, like, and it's been this recurring question that I've been asked for such a long time. It's like choosing one genre over another. I was like, that never even crossed my mind. Like, when I first started making rave records, I was also playing drums in a hardcore punk band. And just that always made sense to me.
And when did you kind of focus? Because was it sort of your overriding goal, let's say in like the late 80s, when, was there was a spell when you moved to a kind of, was it like a semi-abandoned factory, and it was kind of, there was no running water, and it was, pretty intense. And was it a couple of years you were working there on your music? By that stage, was your overriding aim to be Moby, to be a solo artist, and, to kind of smash it as you've gone on to do, or was that?
My goal, I lived in this abandoned factory from about, I guess, 87 to 89. And it's funny, when people describe it, it sounds very unpleasant. Like an abandoned factory. I didn't have running water. I didn't have a bathroom. To be fair, there was running water and a bathroom in a part of the building. It just wasn't near where I was. And it's also worth remembering, it was in a crack neighborhood. So like, there were gunshots, people getting killed. But I was so happy there. It was this fascinating place. And I had free electricity. For some reason, they never turned off the electricity. And I just got to work on music. So my goal at that point was to maybe make a 12-inch for a dance label, and to maybe DJ a couple times a week. Beyond that, I had no ambitions at all. Like, I didn't even think beyond that. Like, I thought those things were unattainable. So I never ever for a second expected that I would make music that anyone would actually listen to.
And what changed along the way? What was the moment that you would say that things really started to get serious?
Well, it happened pretty quickly. In 1990, I signed to a label called Instinct Records. And some of the stuff in hindsight it sounds so sad. When I signed to Instinct Records, they didn't have an office, they'd never released records, and they didn't have a name. So I basically signed to an idea because these were the only, the two guys, Dave and Jared, who started it, were the only two people who were interested in the music I was making. And so I signed with them, and I set up my equipment in Jared, the label boss's living room. And I basically just worked there. And I also, like, in addition to making music there, I was also like, I cleaned the apartment, and I sent faxes, and I would bring records to UPS and the post office to ship them. But it changed almost overnight when I did a remix of the song Go. So the song Go, the original version was this very weird, obscure, minimal techno track. And then there was a label in the UK called Outer Rhythm. And the man who ran it, his name was Guy, he wanted to release the song, but he said he needed a remix. And so I added the strings from Laura Palmer's theme from Twin Peaks to this minimal remix of Go. And somehow it became this massive rave anthem.
And did you kind of know you were onto something when you were doing that? Did you think, whoa, this sounds like pretty...
No, I had no idea.
Unbelievable. I
have never, anything I've ever done, any piece of music I've ever made that's been successful, when I made it, I had no idea. I was like, I've made pieces of music that I thought were going to be successful, and no one cared about them. The most successful music I've ever made, I assumed was marginal, that no one would pay attention to. So Go, when I added the strings from Twin Peaks, I remember I left a tape of it for Jared, who was running the record label. And I said, oh, what do you think? I don't know if it's too obvious. And I remember he called me and left a message on my answering machine saying, oh, actually, I think this is quite special. So luckily, I've had people around me who've been able to identify when something is worth actually releasing.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And that's often the case for artists, that they don't necessarily know what's going to be the massive hit as opposed to not, but
yeah,
just keep making the music. So in terms of from the breakthrough of Go, what happened from there? You know, this must have been the moment where you started, for example, touring quite regularly. And how did you find that and adapt to that?
Well, at first, I loved it so much. I mean, because again, keeping in mind, when I was growing up playing in punk rock bands and DJing in dive bars, I never expected to play in front of an audience. And then all of a sudden, 91, 92, 93, the rave scene was exploding, and I was flying to countries, because I grew up very poor, so I never expected I would even leave my neighborhood, let alone the country. And so suddenly I'm flying back and forth to Europe. I'm going to Australia. I'm going to South America, going to all these places. And the rave scene at that point was so joyful. There was no real darkness in it. Like, you'd walk into a rave and it would be 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 people hugging each other. And it just felt like this utopia. And I couldn't believe that I was somehow a part of it. And so at that point, the touring was just idyllic and delightful. Like, it was really wonderful. And then I guess in around 95, the rave scene started getting darker, and I started sort of moving away from it. And I made my first real album, Everything Is Wrong, and did like an official tour. And that was very exciting, because also I'd been sober for a long time. And during that tour, I started drinking. So suddenly I thought, like, oh, this is so interesting. I'm a touring musician who gets drunk every night. Like, there was such a novelty in that. And then I went on tour with the Flaming Lips and the Chili Peppers, and it felt so legitimate in a way that I'd never anticipated. So till then, I loved it. And then in around 96, and I'll try and keep it brief, but in 96, things got really dark. Like, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. I was battling panic attacks and depression. I was drinking and doing tons of drugs. And I made this album, Animal Rights, that just failed. I mean, it And it was when a lot of my friends were making very successful electronic records, and I made this super aggressive industrial punk rock record. And it basically killed my career. Like, so by 97, I had been dropped by Elektra Records. I was broke. My mom was dying. It was bad. And the last record I thought I was going to make was the album Play. And I thought Daniel Miller, who owned Mute Records, was going to release it sort of honestly as a charitable favor.
Well, it turned out to be an absolute, smash. But from what I gather, because I guess I would have started listening to it when it was already kind of like a classic. It would have been 5 years after, and it was still everywhere. So did it start off being, moderately successful, and then the amount of licensing, the amount of appearances it made suddenly just grew to like this huge mass, and then it just became like a classic?
Well, it started off, and when Play was released, it failed. And I can quantitatively prove that. The first 2 shows that I did on the tour for Play, one was in the basement of a Virgin Megastore in Union Square. And I think between 20 and 30 people were there. And the second was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the first day of the Play tour. And I'm pretty sure we sold approximately 100 tickets. So, and I mean, Play, this was back when I read reviews. Like, I learned a long time ago, I don't read reviews. I don't read press about myself. I don't pay attention to myself in a public figure capacity at all. Because psychologically, I don't have the fortitude to do that. So, yeah. But back then I read reviews, and I remember like Melody Maker gave it a terrible review. The majority of reviews were just either scathing or people just ignored it. Most places like Rolling Stone didn't review it. The only good review it got, I think, was in Spin Magazine. And I will be undyingly grateful to Spin Magazine ever since for actually being like the only nice review that I received for the album Play.
Well, I mean, it's gone on to sort of sell 10 million plus from what I can read, but it's probably more than that, and become a classic of your career. And I mean, now at this point, with your new album Reprise, I mean, do you feel like you're kind of a legend in that when you're talking about electronic music artists and you're talking about greatest of all time, like a lot of people would probably put you in that bracket, particularly because of that album. Do you kind of look back and feel like I've really had a great life and I've achieved a lot? I mean, it sounds like there's been definite ups and downs. Do you feel super proud of what you've achieved? And what's the kind of thinking at this stage to look back, both with Reprise and the documentary?
I mean, it's funny. One would assume, I mean, especially because my ambitions were so meager to begin with, one would assume that because professionally, artistically, things have worked out more than I imagined they would, one would assume that I would take some like pride and satisfaction in that, but I don't. I mean, I'm very grateful that I've been able to do the things that I've been able to do, release records, tour. But really, and the goal, like especially in Moby Doc, in the documentary, the goal is to show that external things, and that, forgive me if this sounds trite, but it's obviously a truth that very few people have learned, that external things don't fix internal issues. Like if we had been talking, or granted, I don't know if you would have been born then, but if we had been talking in 1985 and you had said to me, oh, I have a crystal ball, and in this crystal ball, I can see that you are going to be signed to record labels, you're going to sell millions of records, you're going to tour, you're going to become friends with celebrities, I would have thought, wow, I'll be the happiest person in the world. But as those things happened, the happiness didn't follow, and like the happiness didn't ensue. And I'm not complaining, because it's, maybe that's a shortcoming on my part. But what I learned, and what I'm really grateful for, is I learned that nothing external will fix internal issues. And there's so much historical precedent that sort of proves that point. Just looking at, our last president, Donald Trump, like he was president of the United States. He's probably the most miserable human being on the planet. I mean, his incompetence and psychopathy and racism definitely contribute to that. But like, how many people have had phenomenal success and their response is to become alcoholics, drug addicts? Their response is to kill themselves. And it's like one of these, almost like a Dickensian lesson, where unless you experience it, you'll never believe it.
Yeah, that's
everybody.
So true.
Yeah, I mean, we all assume like, oh, everyone's like, if I had that, I'd be happy. It's like, I thought the same thing, but then I had it and it didn't work.
And what do you think is the key, therefore, to fixing those internal issues and trying to keep yourself happy, just focusing on the little things?
It's, the expression death by 1,000 cuts?
Yeah.
It's the opposite of that, which should be an expression that does, so healing by 1,000 non-cuts.
Plasters.
And it's also being willing to look at the evidence of what, on a sustainable level, what works. And I mean sustainable in the most basic description of what sustainable means, like something that can be done over a period of time to the benefit of whatever is engaged in that action. So it's basically being willing to say, oh, alcohol and drugs are fine, but if you rely on them, they will destroy you. And there's nothing wrong with fame, but if you expect it to fix you, it will destroy you. And there's nothing wrong with degeneracy, but it can't take the place of actual like quotidian healing. So for me, and what's funny is regarding music, which is ostensibly the main reason we're talking, it's taken me back to where I sort of started out, which is just the love of music for the sake of music, not music's ability to deliver fame or accolades or wealth. It's simply the phenomenal power that music has to communicate emotion, and for a way in which for like a musician to express him or herself and reach other people. And like, so it's really wonderful being almost sort of like transported back to that place.
Yeah. And I mean, well, on the new record, there is, I mean, particularly the track The Lonely Night, with Chris Christopherson and Mark Lanigan. I feel that that's something where it's, kind of regardless of how the album does, I'm imagining that's in particular a track that is going to hold a very special place. And it's it's an awesome collaboration. Like how did that come about? And is that kind of one of your favorites from the record?
Yeah, I mean, the songs on the record, it's broadly speaking, it's like 50% of them are songs that people might already know, and 50% are most likely songs that very few people have ever heard. And The Lonely Night was an obscure song on my album Innocence, and Innocence is kind of an obscure album. So an obscure song on an obscure album, so very few people ever heard it. But I always just, I mean, especially with Mark Lanigan, his lyrics, his vocals, I thought it was so beautiful. And I have spent so much of my life reaching out to people whose work I like, asking them to work on things with me, assuming they won't, assuming that they'll say no, which oftentimes is the case. But every now and then I'll work up my courage and reach out to someone and they'll actually say yes. Like Mark Lanigan, I thought he was going to be the meanest person on the planet because he has that deep voice and he seems kind of scary. And I asked him if he wanted to work on a song together, and turns out he's a lovely, almost shy, just wonderful, creative human being. And the same thing with Chris Christopherson. Like, I didn't know how he was going to respond, but I was like, well, if you don't ask, you'll never know. So, I mean, there are plenty of people I've asked who either have never gotten back to me or have just categorically said no. But every now and then the stars align and you get, Mark Lanigan and Chris Christopherson singing this phenomenal song together.
Yeah, it's incredible to have those two artists together. Amazing. And I'm certain there's not many people that they'd say yes to, because they're both legends. So yeah, it's amazing. And so both the album and the documentary are out on the 28th of May. I wanted to finish off the interview by asking you about your tattoo, which it says vegan for life, right?
I got a few.
You got a few of them, but I wanted to ask about that one. When did you become vegan? And if anyone's bored, I actually have a TED talk about it. But relatively briefly, I grew up the way almost everybody else grew up, with this weird paradox of loving animals. Like the house I grew up in, we had a lot of rescued animals. We had rescued dogs, cats, mice, iguanas. So I loved our rescued animals, but I also loved Burger King. And until I was 19 years old, that never seemed paradoxical, because it's the dominant paradigm. Like, talk to 99% of the people on the planet and they love animals and they're horrified by animal suffering, but they eat bacon and Burger King. And when I was 19, I had another Saul on the road to Damascus moment. And I suddenly realized that I loved these rescued animals, and they had two eyes, a central nervous system, and profoundly rich emotional lives. And I just realized in an instant, oh, every animal has a profoundly rich emotional life, maybe not even by human criteria, but like clearly by their criteria. And the most basic instinct to avoid pain and suffering and to be healthy and happy. And at that moment, when I was 19, this was 1983, 84, I realized that's when I went vegetarian. And I was like, I cannot be in good conscience involved in anything that causes or contributes to animal suffering. And then a few years later, in 1987, I went vegan. So it's been now, my math is not great, but almost 34 years. Wow.
And it's the single most important thing to me. Like, I love making music. I love making records. But to me, that's like, making music is joyful. Making music is a process that I love. Veganism and working for animal rights, that's my job. That's my, it's almost like making music for me is like this wonderful creative release from the stresses of thinking about animal rights and veganism.
That's super interesting. I want to watch the TED talk, listen to the TED talk, and also listen to Animal Rights, the record that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's actually a record that I'm quite proud of, because it should have ended my career. Like it was, it sold nothing. It got the worst reviews. I will say there were 3 people who told me how much they liked it. And I'm name dropping, and this might be shameful, but I thought this was so like, it failed so hard, but Axl Rose told me that he used to listen to it on repeat. Bono told me that he loved it as much as the first Clash album. And I got my favorite piece of fan mail, and maybe you won't know who this is, but I thought this was really adorable. Terrence Trent D'Arby.
Oh yeah.
Terrence Trent D'Arby sent me a piece of fan mail on Terrence Trent D'Arby stationery, basically saying, like, and I'd never met him. I still have never met him, saying, ignore the haters, ignore the bad reviews. You've made a wonderful record. Congratulations. So
that's pretty high praise. Screw the critics is what I say to that.
Axl Rose, Bono, and Terrence Trent D'Arby told me they liked the record. And so that's a record that I'm quite proud of, even if objectively it failed in every way that a record could fail.
Well, yeah, I mean, you should be by the sounds of things because they're all geniuses. Moby, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Your new album Reprise out on the 28th of May for those listening. Moby Doc out on the same day, 28th of May. Both really worth checking out. And yeah, I really appreciate your time. And it's certainly clear from talking to you that I've read a quote saying you'd lived 9 lives in one, and that is very clear from 40 minutes of chatting to you. So it was a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And thanks.
Yeah, it was a pleasure as well. Thanks for letting me ramble on. Like, nothing makes me feel like an old guy, like rambling on like an old guy.
This episode is brought to you by Tingly. Tingly is on a mission to change the culture of gifting by encouraging everyone to give experiences rather than material things. Tingly's passionate team has handpicked the world's best experiences, including travel, adventure, romance, food, wine, and more, and brought them all together in one place. Tingly gives the recipient of the experience freedom of choice. Here's how it works. You purchase a gift box, Tingly sends an e-voucher or delivers a plastic-free gift box, and the recipient chooses from hundreds of experiences in over 100 different countries. There's no expiry date on any of Tingly's gift experiences. Tingly encourages us to give stories, not stuff, to treasure memories above possessions. To find out more, go to tingly.com.
If you're enjoying the Greatest Music of All Time podcast, you can keep up to date with all of our latest episodes for free by subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, the subscribe button is located at the top of the Tom Cridland YouTube page. It's also at the bottom right of any video that you watch on YouTube. If you're listening on an audio platform, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe at the top of the page.